Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm looking at some more UK politics, and I'm looking at the power of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. And what I'm really focusing on here in this is going to be a series of case studies. So I'm going to look at Thatcher and Blair and Cameron and use this to try and give you some examples that you can use to exemplify the power or lack of it of Prime Ministers and their governments at various points in time. This is part of my playlist on A-level politics, and in particular it's looking at the edXL A-level politics component 2, and the section is 3.3.2, the powers of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet to dictate events and determine policy. And what the specification tells you have to be able to do is students must study the influence of one Prime Minister from 1945 to 1997 and one post-1997 Prime Minister. Students may choose any pre-97 and any post-97 Prime Minister, provided they study them in an equivalent level of detail, covering both events and policy, with examples that illustrate both control and lack of control. Right, so as I said, I've actually picked three. So I'm going to do Thatcher as our pre-97, and then I'm going to do Blair and Cameron as post-97. Initially I was just going to do Blair and Thatcher, which is kind of two of the big iconic prime ministers. But what I think Cameron adds to this is he gives us someone who's in a very, very different situation, because there are similarities in some of the circumstantial stuff with both Blair and Thatcher, in particular the fact that they both sit on very large majorities at various points in time, something that Cameron just never does. So hopefully all this will give you plenty of examples to use in any essay writing on this particular topic, and give you a deeper understanding of the different things that can play into the position of a Prime Minister. So to start off with, I'm going to look at Margaret Thatcher. Well, she became Conservative leader in 1975 when the Conservatives were in opposition. And she then won the 1979 election, gaining a majority of 43. That majority rose very significantly in 1983 to 144. And though it fell, it was still very, very healthy following the election of 1987 with a majority of 102. Thatcher then resigns in 1990. So she is Prime Minister for 11 years. She has a reputation as the Iron Lady, someone who was incredibly strong. Now, she is loved by some and hated by others, and I think a lot of the way that people will react to this is probably going to be stronger on Thatcher as a Prime Minister than it will be on anybody else, because she tends to divide opinion that strongly. Her ideology was New Right ideology, often referred to in the UK as Thatcherism. And New Right ideology is a mixture of neoconservatism and neoliberalism, and essentially it's economically quite hard right in terms of complete freedoms in markets, and it is in terms of social policy highly conservative, and so kind of looking at really kind of traditional old-fashioned values. So you've got a bit of an unusual mix, because you're complete economic freedom, but really not complete social freedom. So it was an idea, the New Right, that came over from America, and part of the basis of Thatcher's kind of greatest ally, which is Ronald Reagan, is a connection between them in terms of political ideology. In terms of her foreign policy, there are some fairly major events, notably the Falklands War in 1982. There is, as I mentioned, a very close relationship with the US, the special relationship with and her and Ronald Reagan are seen to get on particularly well. She was seen as particularly hardline when it came to this period of the Cold War, and that was where she earned the reputation as the Iron Lady. I mean, other major issues that are going on at this time mean that there are some fairly controversial things, such as the miners' strike, there's Section 28 in education policy. There's the whole issue of Europe. There are the troubles in Ireland, and there are poll tax riots, which right at the end of Thatcher's time in office. Economically, her policy is based on something known as monetarism. Now, the ideas of monetarism again proved to be highly controversial and have fairly wide-ranging effects on the economy. We'll look at those in a bit more detail shortly. She and Thatcher and her government saw the benefits of North Sea oil and gas coming online, and this helped the economy out when it was in a pretty bad way in the early 80s. She led some fairly massive economic changes with privatisation and deregulation of financial markets and the right to buy scheme, and there was a huge economic boom in the 80s, followed by a fairly devastating crash. So early in her office, Thatcher demonstrated her ability to overcome any kind of opposition to her and our ideas in cabinet. Notably, following the monetarist budget in 1981, that this is probably, well, at the time it was argued it was the most unpopular budget ever. I mean, there was an expectation that actually there would have been an easing off of the policy in 81, that the economy was starting to show signs of improvement, especially balance of payments because of North Sea oil and gas, but actually they tightened the ship even further. She was seen to use her cabinet far less than her earlier prime ministers, and again, this was really kind of way that she was portrayed in the media. There's a famous old sketch from the Spitting Image puppets in which her and the cabinet are at a restaurant, and she orders the steak, and she's asked what about the vegetables, and she says they'll have the same. And so we see this idea of Thatcher as a really strong, dominant prime minister who kind of quashed any kind of rumblings or any disagreements with her early on in her cabinet. And this sticking to her guns early on seems to pay off with the big victory in 1982, and after that she has a pretty united cabinet, and Britain went on to experience an economic boom. So there are definitely struggles early on for Thatcher, so it's kind of 79 through to 81. And she seemed to overcome that, and that's one of the reasons why people talk about her strength as a leader and her kind of overcoming the opposition with her own cabinet. Now, this idea of monetarism, which I've spoken about, the idea of this is you're going to strictly control inflation. If you look at political history or British history from the 1970s, and there are huge problems with inflation, and the idea of monetarism was that you could control inflation, and inflation was the main enemy in terms of an enemy of the economy. So what you did is you reduced government spending, you restricted the money supply, so the amount of money that was produced and was in circulation, and you used interest rates to stop the economy overheating by putting interest rates really high, or to get the economy going by making interest rates lower. And this policy also broke away from the post-war consensus, which had put at the top priority of the economy was full employment. This was the top priority no longer, and there were unusually high levels of unemployment during the 1980s and followed into the 1990s because of this monetarist policy. But this again is one aspect in terms of politically. It showed the strength of Thatcher in her ideals, that she was able to fundamentally change from previous governments, previous Conservative and previous Labour governments, the central element of economic philosophy. Now, there were numbers of events, again, further events under her control. So she did fundamentally change the economic landscape in the UK. She clashed with and largely defeated the trade union movement. Again, this saw a massive economic shift because the trade union power, which had played such a major part of UK politics in the 1960s and 1970s, was rather put to the sword by Thatcher in the 1980s, again suggesting this idea of a dominant prime minister in control of what was going on. Her policies in terms of economic policy, things such as the privatisation of key industries, and there's a whole long list of these. This is just some of them: BP, British Petroleum, BT, British Telecom, British Gas, Jaguar, British Airways, Rolls-Royce, the steel industry, the water industry, the electricity industry. Now, this was all privatised, and what happened was that millions of people who had never owned shares before suddenly became share owners because the shares were issued, again, according to most analysts at the time, massively undervalued, which meant that ordinary people and corporations went out and bought them as much as they possibly could and then sold them to make substantial profits fairly quickly. And this thing with the stock market and financial markets driving economic success in the UK was a really big part of Thatcher and her ideology. And we see financial deregulation of the City of London, which helps it regain its position as a financial world centre. And we see what's referred to as the Big Bang in 1986 with a huge explosion in terms of stock values and trading in London. The right to buy process meant that thousands of people got onto the property ladder and were able to own property for the first time ever by buying their council houses. Again, in definite short-term gain in that, and huge boost in popularity. And it shifted actually in a way some of the Conservative base, because these were new groups of voters that the Conservative Party hadn't been able to get into before, and this is again one of the reasons why in the 1980s we see these massive majorities for Thatcher's governments. It does cause some fairly major long-term problems, however, with a complete lack of council housing if you think about housing crises later on. But at the time it was again an area that showed economic policy was an area that Thatcher had a great deal of control over, and it's something that brought about some fairly significant changes. Now, of course, not everything was completely smooth. So, for example, I mean, and some of this is lack of control. It's not always necessarily things going badly wrong. There are actually quite a lot of stuff with all the prime ministers which we look at where the circumstances are beyond their control. Now, and sometimes this can be negative, and we'll definitely see that with economic circumstances with Cameron, who it takes over at a point of economic crisis. But we see with Thatcher, and that also in a different way, but with Blair, actually, there are things that they didn't control, which actually really helped them and therefore put them in a stronger position as Prime Minister. So the economic problems that Britain had, particularly a big balance of payments problem, were kind of erased or significantly reduced at least by North Sea oil and gas coming online in the early 80s. Now, this isn't something that Thatcher and her government had all put in place. It was kind of, it had been moving for a period of time under the previous governments, and this happened to be the moment when it came into being, really. There would have been a really good chance, actually, that Thatcher's legacy could have been very, very different, because the economic situation in 81 wasn't particularly good, and in 81, 82, the political position of Thatcher's government and her entire scheme in terms of economic policy and everything else looked in a really weak position, and there was a good chance that the next election could have been a disaster. However, the Falklands War changed public perception of Thatcher to a large extent, united the party behind her, and catapulted her into a massive electoral victory. The UK at this time was a highly divided place, and we can see this again, as we said, that Thatcher will get reactions very strongly one way or the other. I mean, we see, for example, in many places, including Toxteth and Liverpool in 1981, we saw riots which were largely based on issues of racial inequality and poverty. Very famously, there's the miners' strike, 1984-85. And all of this showed that the government, although trying to put itself in a position of being in control of everything, absolutely wasn't, and therefore there were elements of UK the UK voters and UK society and the UK media that Thatcher was never able to get on board, and she faced very, very strong criticism going all the way through her time in office. One area where she definitely didn't seem to maintain control was over the issues involving Ireland, and this is illustrated through the bombing campaigns in the 1980s. And closest to home for Thatcher and the Conservative government was the Brighton bomb in 1984, where the party conference was attacked. Now, there are other issues or problems of control that Thatcher faced. Part of it, again, early on she gained control of the cabinet and a kind of centralised power on that, but this doesn't last forever, and we start to see the divides within the Conservative Party emerge as the 1980s go on. And there's a particular incident which is known as the Westland Affair, which is to do with who was going to be taking over control of the helicopter manufacturer, and whether it was going to be a European group or whether it was going to be a US group. And there was a clash between Thatcher and Heseltine on this, and Michael Heseltine resigned, and this was really damaging to the position of the cabinet and Thatcher at the time, and would come back and haunt her 4 years later as Heseltine stands against her in the leadership election, leading to her fall. And another bit that is important to note about Thatcher's kind of personality, really, I think, as a Prime Minister is yes, in some areas she stuck to her guns and she was seen to win out, but in other areas she's obstinate, she's stubborn, she sticks to her ideas. I mean, she famously once said, "Turn if you want to, this lady's not for turning." Well, on issues where, in terms of public opinion, definitively she got things wrong, and there was massive protests against her policies, then she still refused to budge, and this again damaged her legacy and her position as Prime Minister. So that there was a notable criticism over Section 28, which banned promotion of homosexualities on an equal footing in schools, and that was in 1988, and then we see the poll tax protests and riots in 1990. And this on top of what we've already seen. There's been public disturbances going all the way back to places in the early 80s, and we've seen all the miners' strikes in the mid 80s, and we've seen all the stuff with the IRA bombing campaigns in the 80s. So the idea that this is a unified and calm country with Thatcher in kind of universal control, it would be very misleading. There are significant problems and significant challenges to her position. The economic success would have been this big boom in the mid 80s. This kind of all collapsed towards the end of the 80s, and by 1990 inflation, which the Conservatives have been their prime goal to destroy inflation, which they seem to have done a reasonable job at, but by the time you got to 1990 inflation was just under 11%. The balance of payments was a problem again. There was tensions within the Conservative Party over, you've guessed it, Europe. This led to the resignation of Thatcher's longest serving member of cabinet, Sir Geoffrey Howe. And then we get the challenge from Heseltine. And ultimately, this kind of abrasive and overbearing style of government that Thatcher had used, it kind of came back to haunt her in a way, because early on she'd crushed any degree of opposition. But then when the chips were down and things turned against her, the circumstances turned against her, she found that she had a limited number of true allies and a group of people who were quite happy to see her out of the way. So a kind of a mixed bag here, kind of one of the most famous, iconic UK prime ministers, and definitely both a love and a hate figure amongst different groups within the UK, and a very controversial period of UK political history, and in a lot of ways quite a divisive one, but one that saw fundamental rebuilding of the economy, which does demonstrate and of economic policy, and that kind of does demonstrate the power that an ideologically driven prime minister who wins big majorities can have, because the size of those majorities is one of the reasons why Thatcher had a fairly free hand and didn't have to worry too much about internal divisions, because the majorities were so big. Now, the next Prime Minister I'm going to look at is Tony Blair. Now, he became leader of the Labour Party in 1994 and was Prime Minister from 1997 to 2007. Now, he won elections in 1997 with a majority of 179. And in 2001 with a majority of 167, and in 2005 with a majority of 66. So at no point is Blair looking at a tense kind of small majority, something that kind of prime ministers in the past, particularly in the post Thatcher era, would have dreamed of this, of even outdoing Thatcher herself in terms of the sizes of his majorities. His reputation has been a centralist, a kind of a political moderate, but his reputation ultimately is severely damaged by the war in Iraq. Ideologically, he was a follower of what is known as the Third Way, which is a combination of social democracy with some neoliberal ideas about the economy. It's a form of socialism, but how much socialism there is in it is something that lots of people would debate. In foreign policy, everything was pretty successful up until the war in Iraq in 2003. He was kind of widely respected as a world leader. He gained huge recognition across the world for his role in the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process in Ireland. Now, in terms of economic policy, Labour's government both start off with kept conservative spending plans and low taxes at the start. They progressed on to bring on substantial investment in public services, but no return to the old Labour ideas of nationalisation, etc. And there were some fairly major controversies, notably, again, as I mentioned, the Iraq War. There was the whole thing with the Brown-Blair relationship, and there were the numerous anti-terror laws that were introduced as well. So some evidence then that Blair was in control. Well, firstly, you just have to look at some of the parliamentary arithmetic. The size of those victories in 97 and 2001 in particular was so big. I mean, it's something that was, again, really remarkable if you kind of compare it to what we've been used to in more recent years. He got into power in 97, and he didn't lose a vote in the House of Commons until 2005. So if you think that, like, Boris Johnson lost all his early votes in the House of Commons, so he didn't get it. And whilst we've got here with Blair going 8 years until he suffered one, and when he lost one, it was on extending time police could hold terror suspects before charging them. Again, one of these areas of controversy, one of these areas which Blair and his government struggled with, I think. Now, the Conservative government under Major had been very much divided again over Europe, and this has been very public, and been obviously scandals and all been very badly handled, and so they were seen as a kind of a highly divided and toxic group. Labour had been in opposition for a very, very long time, and these circumstances combined to give Blair the ability to create a highly united party in his early years, one with strong control, often referred to as spin, in terms of how the party and government was perceived and presented itself to the media, where everybody essentially towed the party line. And what Blair did is he reduced the independence of power of cabinet members. Now, with the circumstances he was in, he could get away with that, because you've got a party that's not been in government for 18 years, who's suddenly been handed the biggest majority kind of ever, and is then really as the person who's brought that about, he was really able to go, look, and now I've got you here. This is what we're going to do. There were some key figures in this and key organisations. There's Jonathan Powell, who acted as chief of staff. Again, Blair was seen as being very, very presidential, and the Jonathan Powell at the centre of it as a chief of staff, kind of coordinating everything, looked very much like the system that you'd have in a presidential style in America. Another key figure in this was Alistair Campbell, a couple of who was in charge of all dealings with the press, and you've got a couple of key organisations as well. You've got the Prime Minister's delivery unit, which ensures that Blair was essentially had central control over all policy areas, and the strategic communications unit, which was headed by Alistair Campbell, that made sure that Blair had control over the media message and what was going out from the party. So probably even more so than Thatcher, Blair really kind of centralised power in his own hands. Now, the government was able, again, to bring about some fairly notable changes, which isn't surprising, again, given the position that it was in after the election. So it brought in devolution and Lords reform, Greatest success, arguably, of Blair's term in office was the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, and Blair's personal interventions were seen as being very important in this, in helping to secure agreement between these two very different sides, and later restored devolved government after a period of direct rule. So on that, Blair's reputation is pretty strong, and that again suggests, as a Prime Minister, he could get directly involved in policy and could make a difference. Now, in the context of Blair's government, one area you could talk about is economic success. Now, the economy was improving when Labour won in '97, and it continued to do well. Now, part of that is going to be because of good management, and part of that is just the circumstances of economic cycles. Now, Blair then leaves before the next part of the economic cycle. So he leaves in '97. The world economic crisis is in 2008. So he does his 10 years. Everything economically is fine, and then the world economically kind of blows up the year after he goes. And so we don't see those same kind of economic challenges to Blair as we saw degrees of with Thatcher, and we will see very much with Cameron. And what it's enabled him to do was to push forward with public sector reform. He aimed to stop the widening gap between rich and poor, and also pursue a kind of socially liberal agenda. And successes were quite widespread on this. We saw an increased number of people staying in school up until the age of 18, which the leaving age was 16 at the time. But things like educational maintenance allowance, or EMA, allowed more students from poorer backgrounds to stay into sixth form and get A levels and equivalents, then go on to university. And the percentage of people going to university increased dramatically. There were Sure Start centres to help families in deprived areas. There was a national minimum wage introduced. There were free nursery places. And then so that's in terms of addressing ideas of welfare and reducing the gap between rich and poor. And in terms of the socially liberal agenda, we see the introduction of civil partnerships for same-sex couples, and therefore we can see Blair again in a different way, but a similar idea in terms of power, like Thatcher, was able to fundamentally change some aspects about the UK. Now, he didn't have it all his own way, and one of the interesting bits in terms of Blair as a case study is this relationship with Gordon Brown. So Gordon Brown is generally considered to have been a very successful chancellor. Again, a slightly divisive figure, so it probably depends on who you ask on that. But whose reputation, Brown's reputation, is obviously damaged by the economic crisis of 2008, and then his time in office as Prime Minister. Now, for us, for the study of Blair, the relationship between the two of them is absolutely key. Now, it is understood there was a long-standing agreement going back to '94, where Brown said he would give Blair a kind of a clear run and his support going for the party leadership. That when they then won power, Brown would be made Chancellor, and then, according to Brown's version of the agreement, eventually would become Prime Minister after Blair did 2 terms. Now, what this means is actually this all-powerfully seeming Prime Minister in the form of Blair isn't quite as all-powerful as he first appears, because he can't really choose his Chancellor. The Chancellor has to be Brown. He cannot sack him, he cannot remove him. Not necessarily he would have done anything in the time that Blair was in office that would have justified him being moved out or removed or any way like that. But it suggests that Blair isn't completely presidential and acting without restrictions. It's not normal cabinet government, and it's more of a leadership duo than anything else. But it is an important kind of counter to his power. And the relationship starts to deteriorate after 2005, to which Brown is basically continually saying, "Are you still here?" And Blair's going, "Yes, and we see the development, because there's a clear power struggle between the Brownites and the Blairites with their forming factions within the government and within the party more broadly, both in Parliament and outside. One division was over joining the euro, which we understand Blair was keen on and Brown wasn't, and he set up his 5 economic tests and then made sure they weren't met. So things aren't always easy in terms of within government for Blair. He also had a bit of a problem with the party in general. I mean, Blair is very much kind of to the centre, to the right of the Labour Party, and so some of his moves were opposed by the left. Now this is only going to be a really major issue once you get past 2005, because before that his majorities are just so big. And so there was some fairly major fight back over tuition fees for university, over some of the marketisation within health and education, such as the kind of setting up of city academies and foundation hospitals, and this kind of introduction of more business practice into the public sector. And there was resistance within the Labour Party, and there's resistance within the trade unions to this as well. And foreign policy had initially been an area where Blair was kind of very seemingly impressively in control, and he would do things like speak to French media in French and things like that, and everybody was kind of like, wow, this is slightly special for a UK Prime Minister. But ultimately it's foreign policy that will be the most damaging thing to Blair's legacy. Following 9/11, he committed the UK supporting the US war on terror. Now we get back now into this special relationship, and there was a bit of this with Reagan and Thatcher, but it's more so with Blair and Bush, where it's seen increasingly not as a special relationship, but more Blair doing what Bush says. So Blair as Bush's poodle, a bit like as Thatcher was referred to as being under Reagan. Though again, I think that power balance was probably more equal than the one we see with Bush and Blair. The Iraq War was fought on this dossier of inaccurate intelligence about weapons of mass destruction. There was a lack of planning into what was going to happen once Saddam Hussein had been removed, and the world has had to live with those consequences ever since, in terms of the power vacuum that was created in Iraq. The final of our kind of three cases I'm going to look at is David Cameron. And the reason I wanted to add Cameron to this is because we've got a Prime Minister with very, very different circumstances. So he became the leader of the Conservatives in 2005. He became Prime Minister in 2010, but he didn't win a majority in 2010. He formed a coalition government. He then won the 2015 election with a majority of 12. So as we can see, in terms of power and then constraints on power, Cameron is in a whole different world to that of either Thatcher or in particular in comparison to Blair. Now he's almost kind of your conservative equivalent of Blair in a way, that he's very kind of media friendly. He comes across well. He has initially a fairly broad support within his party. He in terms of the Conservative Party, he's seen as being a liberal or progressive conservative, and one of his key aims was to remove this idea of the Conservatives as the nasty party. That they were more concerned about the people than in the era of Thatcherism. So he's never got a comfortable parliamentary majority, so he's never seemingly in a particularly strong position. So this is an interesting example, case study to look at, to see, well, what can a Prime Minister do in more difficult circumstances? Now, he had a good standing internationally, and again, in terms of on the world stage, he was seen to handle himself well. He did manage 5 years of coalition government working with the Lib Dems. I mean, lots of people at the time just simply didn't believe that this coalition government would survive an entire full term, and it did. One thing, though, the numbers suggest that he's in quite a weak position. One of the things that was in his favour is he did face a rather disunited and weak Labour Party during this period. So, areas of control. Well, there was this relationship between Cameron and Clegg, which meant that they were able to operate the coalition fairly smoothly. Now, politically, ideologically, they weren't actually miles apart. Clegg coming from what's known as the Orange Book element of the Liberal Democrats, Cameron coming from the more liberal progressive form of the Conservative Party. There were actually some ideological crossovers between the two, and the government was run essentially by what was known as the Quad, and the Quad was made up of Cameron, Osborne, Clegg, and Danny Alexander. Now, you can argue that this was actually more cohesive than some of the cabinets under Thatcher, or the Brown-Blair relationship with Brown. So although these were 4 people from 2 parties, that actually as a leadership team that this worked fairly smoothly. Cameron was able to maintain control of large degrees of patronage, for example, control of cabinet committees. He was also able to keep the Lib Dems on board with major policy areas. Considering the results of discontent about policies from his own backbenchers, maintaining this government for 5 years and then winning the next election can be seen as a remarkable achievement by a Prime Minister in these given circumstances. And when he was in coalition, he did actually have a comfortable majority. It was a comfortable majority made up of a mixture of Conservatives and Liberals, but it was in that way a fairly strong position. Now, having said that, there's no way that Cameron could have anything like the control that we saw Blair and Thatcher had. First of all, we've got a couple of key bits. We've got the Coalition Agreement for Stability and Reform, and that meant he didn't have the ability to have full control of his own cabinet, which again is a really unusual situation for a Prime Minister. But you could argue we see a bit of it with Blair, don't we, with him not being able to move Brown. But the Lib Dems in the cabinet, they aren't in a position where Cameron can just sack them. He needs the agreement of Clegg to remove them. He was restricted by the actions set out by the Coalition Programme for Government, which limits his ability to bring in his own policies and to act independently. So, and the Lib Dems tended to be very stringent in going, yes, we will do this because we will have agreed to do this. We have it all written down and the I's dotted and T's crossed, and we will do that. You also want to do that? No, we're not doing that as well. If you want our support, we just do what we've agreed. Now, coalition government means a more collective style of government than we've seen under Thatcher or Blair, as there needs to be broader support. There needs to be broader agreement between the 2 parties. So there we've got maybe a lack of control, maybe a moving back more to a kind of more cabinet style of government rather than the more presidential styles of Thatcher and Blair. And although Cameron won an election in 2015, his majority was incredibly small, meaning he was beholden to the far less liberal than him and far more Eurosceptic than him backbenchers of the Conservative Party. So actually, and this is an argument that's often made by Cameron, his real problem wasn't with the Lib Dems. His real problem was from the hardliners on his own backbenchers. Now, there are, again, other things that Cameron didn't have control over either. So first of all, they win the election in 2010. It was argued at the time this was the election that all the parties wanted to lose, because what it meant is you would go into government in the worst economic crisis for generations. The coalition government response to this was austerity. This was not universally popular, I think is probably a fairly large understatement. The social costs of austerity were very wide-ranging, making it very unpopular. The social cost of this really damaged Cameron's own personal claims that he stood for a kind of a softer, more caring form of conservatism, because austerity didn't look softer or more caring. There were some issues in terms of his control of cabinet. Again, he seemed to want to give cabinet ministers a greater degree of independence. We see that this can go badly wrong with Andrew Lansley in health. And there was need for significant U-turns in terms of policies that have been developed there. The 2012 budget was disastrous, and that's called the Omni Shambles, because as 2012 went on, more and more and more and more of the 2012 budget was reversed. Although the same-sex marriage bill passed, again, kind of proof of Cameron's kind of liberal, social liberal credentials, that it passed on the back of some Conservative votes, but mainly Liberal votes and Labour votes. The majority of the Conservative Party actually voted against it. So again, he managed to get some things done, but not necessarily with the full support of his own party. these internal divisions were really what made Cameron come unstuck. With internal divisions over Europe and the threat from UKIP, he announced that there would be, if they won the election in 2015, there would be a referendum on EU membership. He also, then, having won in 2015, announced he would resign before the next election, that he would see out this term, but not another one. And then he led the Remain campaign, and the Remain campaign lost, and he warned that Brexit would be economically and everything disastrous in all kinds of ways, and therefore resigned after the Brexit vote. So again, at the end, and this always is going to be the way, isn't it? Is at the end period for all three of the prime ministers we looked at is the bit that's really damaging and destroys a huge amount of the reputation, because they stop being prime minister because things go wrong. So I hope that has been helpful for you and giving you a bit of insight into those three different prime ministers. Three prime ministers, very different styles, very different circumstances in which they're in power, all of which brought in degrees of change, and the amount of change they brought in varies because of the length of time they were in power and the backing that they had within Parliament. Again, I hope that's been useful. If it has been, please hit like. If you have any comments or queries, then please leave them below. This is part of my A-Level Politics playlist. If you're doing A-Level Politics, then please do subscribe and get notifications for all the different videos. Scroll through the playlist. There should be loads of stuff to help you with all the different bits of the course. There's also a whole load of playlists on A-Level History as well. So subscribe, get notifications as I add more and more stuff. Thank you very much for watching.